I said yes, but not because I wanted to. The dress fit perfectly, like it had been made for me. Every inch of ivory fabric hugging a version of myself I didn't recognize, the kind of bride people smiled at without asking questions, the kind that made everything look normal from a distance. And maybe that was the point, because up close, nothing about this felt like a wedding. It felt like a decision I never got to make, like standing at the edge of something and realizing the ground behind you is already gone. My fingers tightened around the bouquet, the roses soft but the stems wrapped too tightly, the hidden thorns pressing just enough to remind me I was still here, still feeling, still aware that every step forward wasn't choice but momentum, and momentum is a dangerous thing when you don't know how to stop. Smile, someone whispered behind me, maybe my mother, maybe someone else. Voices had started to blur together hours ago, all gentle, all careful, all pretending this was what happiness looked like. And I tried. I really did. I pulled the corners of my lips upward the way I'd practiced in the mirror, but it felt wrong, like putting on someone else's expression and hoping no one noticed it didn't belong. The music started, soft piano echoing through the chapel, each note landing heavier than the last. And that was my cue. That was when my feet were supposed to move. And they did, because they always did, because saying no had never been something I was allowed to do without consequences, and consequences had a way of finding me even when I tried to run. The aisle stretched ahead, longer than it should have been, like the distance kept growing the more I looked at it. White petals scattered across the floor, perfect and untouched, nothing like the inside of my chest where everything felt bruised and uneven and too loud. And at the end of it, Derek stood waiting, dressed in a tailored black suit, smiling the way people smile when they've already won, like the outcome was never in question, like I was just the final step in something he had decided a long time ago. "You look beautiful," he mouthed as I got closer, and I nodded because that was easier than speaking, easier than letting my voice betray me, easier than remembering all the times that same voice had been used to remind me what I owed, what I couldn't escape, what I supposedly chose. The officiant began speaking, words about love and commitment and forever, words that sounded rehearsed because they were, because this script had been written without me. And I stood there, listening, breathing, counting the seconds between each sentence like they might lead me somewhere else, somewhere different, somewhere I could still change my mind. "Do you, Emily Carter," he started, and my heart stuttered, not fast, not loud, just enough to make everything feel slightly off, like the world had shifted an inch to the left, and in that tiny space, something inside me whispered that this wasn't how it was supposed to end, that there was still a moment, still a second, still a chance to say something real instead of what everyone expected. And I opened my mouth, ready to speak, ready to give them the answer they came for, or maybe something else entirely. I wasn't even sure anymore. But before a single word could leave my lips, the sound of the doors at the back of the chapel opening cut through everything, sharp and sudden and completely out of place. And for the first time that day, every eye in the room turned away from me. No one gasped, no one spoke, but the air changed in a way I felt more than heard, like the entire room had taken a breath and forgotten how to let it go. And I did not turn right away because I did not need to, because something in me already knew that whoever had just walked in did not belong to this carefully arranged moment, did not belong to Derek's version of control, and that alone made my pulse shift into something unfamiliar, something sharper, something awake. The footsteps came next, slow and measured against the marble floor, each one precise, unhurried, not asking for attention but taking it anyway. And I watched it happen in reflections before I saw it directly. The way people along the aisle stiffened, the way shoulders straightened, the way conversations that were not supposed to exist inside a ceremony died before they could form. And when I finally turned, it felt less like curiosity and more like gravity pulling me towards something I could not ignore. He was not smiling, not trying to reassure anyone, not trying to fit into the room. And that was the first thing that made him impossible to look away from. Because everyone else here was performing something, happiness, approval, obligation. But him, he was simply there, tall, composed, dressed in a dark suit that looked effortless in a way expensive things often do. His presence cutting clean through the soft colors and rehearsed emotions like a line drawn in ink across a blank page. I had never seen him before, I was certain of that, And yet something about him felt like recognition, not of who he was, but of what he represented: control without noise, power without explanation, the kind that did not need permission to exist. Derek shifted beside me, just enough for me to notice, his hand tightening briefly around mine before releasing. And I realized he had seen him too, that whatever calm confidence he had been wearing seconds ago had cracked, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to call it out. But I felt it, the same way you feel a storm before it arrives, subtle, undeniable. "We are in the middle of something," Derek said, his voice controlled but edged with something thinner than before, and I knew that tone. I knew the way it tried to hold on to authority even when it was slipping, and for the first time that day, I did not feel smaller because of it. The man did not answer immediately, and that silence stretched longer than it should have, long enough to make the officiant hesitate, long enough to make the guests exchange glances they tried to hide, long enough to make my heartbeat steady instead of race. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, even, the kind that did not need to rise to be heard. "You should stop." That was all, no explanation, no raised volume, just a statement placed into the center of the room like it had always belonged there. And something inside me shifted again, not fear, not exactly, but a strange clarity, like a fog lifting just enough for me to see the outline of something real. Derek let out a short breath that was almost a laugh, almost disbelief, and he turned slightly toward the guests as if to pull them back into his control. "I do not know who you think you are, but you do not walk into a private ceremony and interrupt it." And I could hear the effort in his voice now, the careful way he was trying to regain what had slipped, but the room was no longer listening to him the same way, because once something changes, even slightly, it never fully goes back. The man's gaze moved then, not to Derek, but to me, and it was not invasive, not demanding, just direct, steady in a way that made everything else feel distant. And for a second that felt longer than it should have, I forgot about the dress, the guests, the expectations, everything except the fact that someone was looking at me like I was not already decided, like I was not something owned or owed or obligated. And I did not know what that meant yet, but I knew I could not ignore it, not anymore. The silence did not break, it tightened, like something invisible had wrapped itself around the room and pulled just enough to remind everyone that this was no longer a moment they controlled. And I felt it in the way my breath slowed instead of quickened, in the way my shoulders dropped half an inch without me telling them to, like my body recognized something my mind had not caught up to yet. Derek shifted again, this time stepping slightly in front of me, not enough to block me completely, but enough to reclaim space, to reestablish what he believed was his position, and his voice came sharper now, less polished. "This is not your concern," he said, each word measured but thinner than before, like the certainty behind them had already started to fade. The man did not move closer, did not raise his voice, did not react the way most people would when challenged. And that was what made it different, what made it unsettling in a way I could not explain, because he was not trying to win the room. He already had it, and everyone knew it even if no one said it out loud. "It is," he replied, simple, direct, and the way he said it made it sound less like an argument and more like a fact that had already been decided somewhere else, somewhere none of us could see. I felt Derek's hand reach for mine again, tighter this time, fingers pressing just enough to remind me of all the other times that same grip had meant something I did not have words for back then, and my instinct was to freeze, to go still, to let it happen the way I always had. But something in me resisted, not loudly, not dramatically, just a small shift, a fraction of movement as my fingers loosened instead of tightening back. And it was the smallest thing, barely noticeable, but it felt like the first honest reaction I had allowed myself all day. The man's eyes flickered to that movement, not missing it, not reacting to it, just acknowledging it in a way that made my chest feel lighter and heavier at the same time. And I did not understand why that mattered, only that it did. "Emily," Derek said under his breath, a warning wrapped in my name, and I recognized it instantly, the way it was meant to pull me back into place, to remind me of expectations, of consequences, of everything that had led me to this exact moment. And for a second, I almost responded the way I always did, almost nodded, almost reassured him without thinking, but I did not, and the fact that I did not seem to echo louder than anything spoken in the room. The officiant cleared his throat softly, uncertain, caught between continuing and stopping, and the guests shifted in their seats, whispers threatening to form but never quite making it past their lips, because no one wanted to be the first to break whatever this was. "You should leave," Derek said again, louder now, more force behind it, but it did not land the same way it would have minutes ago, because the room had already tilted, already moved into something else, something that did not belong to him anymore. The man's gaze never left mine when he answered, "That is not her decision to be made for her." And the words settled into me with a weight I was not prepared for, not because they were loud or dramatic, but because they were simple, because they were true in a way I had not allowed myself to hear before. And suddenly the question that had been building in the background all along rose to the surface, clear and unavoidable, not what was expected of me, not what I was supposed to say, but what I actually wanted. And for the first time since I stepped into this dress, into this aisle, into this version of my life, I realized I did not know the answer, only that it had never really been mine to give until now. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and undeniable. And for a moment I could not move because something inside me was shifting too fast to keep up with, like the version of myself that had walked down this aisle was being quietly replaced by someone who was still unfamiliar but no longer silent. And I felt it in my chest, in my hands, in the way my breath came slower but deeper, like I was finally taking it in instead of holding it back. Derek turned fully toward me now, his composure cracking just enough for the tension beneath to show, not loud, not explosive, but present in the way his jaw tightened, in the way his eyes searched my face not with certainty, but with expectation, like he was waiting for me to fix this, to say something that would restore the balance he believed he controlled. "Emily," he said again, softer this time, but more urgent, like the tone itself was meant to pull me back into place, to remind me of everything that had led us here, of promises I never truly made, but was still expected to keep, and I knew that tone. I knew how easily it could wrap around me if I let it, how quickly I could fall back into the pattern of nodding, agreeing, smoothing over the moment, so everything could continue as planned. My fingers loosened completely from his hand, the contact breaking without force, without drama, just a quiet separation that felt louder than anything else that had happened, and I saw it register in his expression, not as shock, not yet, but as something uncertain, something that did not fit into the version of this day he had built. The man by the door had not moved, had not stepped forward or raised his voice, and yet his presence felt closer now, like the distance between us had shortened, without either of us crossing it. And when I looked at him again, really looked this time, I noticed the details I had missed before, the stillness in his posture, the way his gaze did not flicker or shift unnecessarily, the way everything about him suggested control that did not need to prove itself. "You are making a scene," Derek said, louder now, directing it outward, trying to reclaim the room, and I felt the familiar pull of that pressure, the expectation to minimize, to quiet, to make things easier for everyone else even if it cost me something I could not name. But the words did not land the same way anymore, because something had already changed and I could not pretend I did not feel it. The officiant looked between us, uncertain, his script forgotten. The ceremony paused in a way that made time feel uneven, stretched, like we were all waiting for something that had not yet been decided, and I realized that for the first time, that decision might actually belong to me. My throat felt tight when I tried to speak, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of finally having something real to say, something that was not rehearsed or expected, and the silence that followed only made it clearer that whatever came next would matter in a way I could not take back. The word barely left my lips before I hesitated, not because I did not know what to say, but because I was not used to hearing my own voice in moments like this, not used to trusting it. And for a second, I looked at Derek, at the life that had been decided for me, at the path that had felt inevitable just minutes ago. And then I looked back at the man who had walked in without permission and somehow changed everything without raising his voice. He did not nod, did not encourage, did not interrupt. He simply waited. And that waiting felt different from anything I had experienced before, because it did not demand, it did not pressure, it did not assume, it just allowed. And in that space, small but undeniable, I felt something steady form inside me, something that had been buried under expectations and fear and obligation for longer than I wanted to admit. My grip tightened slightly around the Bouquet again, the hidden thorns pressing into my palm, grounding me, reminding me that this moment was real, that I was still here, still capable of choosing even if I had forgotten how. And when I finally took a breath deep enough to steady myself, I realized that whatever I said next would not just stop a ceremony. It would change the direction of everything that came after, and for the first time, that thought did not terrify me as much as it should have. The breath I took did not feel like air. It felt like a line being drawn somewhere deep inside me, separating everything I had been from everything I was about to become. And when I finally let the word form, it did not come out the way I expected, not small, not uncertain, but steady in a way that surprised even me. No, the single syllable landed quietly, but it carried further than anything else that had been said, because it was not part of the script, it was not rehearsed, and it did not ask for permission to exist. For a second, no one moved, not the officiant, not the guests, not even Derek, and I could see the exact moment the meaning reached him. The way his expression shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to reveal the crack beneath the surface he had been holding together all day. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice lower now, controlled in a way that tried to contain something rising underneath, and I felt the familiar instinct to soften it, to explain, to make it easier, but I did not, because I knew that if I did, I would lose whatever this moment was giving me. I said no. I repeated, the words clearer this time, not louder, just more certain, and the difference between the two felt like everything, like the space between hesitation and truth finally closing. A murmur rippled through the room, subtle but impossible to ignore, the kind of sound people make when something unexpected breaks the shape of what they came to witness, and I felt every pair of eyes shift toward me, not with judgment exactly, but with something closer to disbelief, like they were watching a version of me they had not anticipated. Derek stepped closer, his hand reaching for my arm again, but I moved before he could touch me, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to create space, and that space felt enormous, like the first real distance I had ever put between us. "You do not mean that," he said, quieter now, more controlled, but the certainty was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like negotiation, like he was trying to pull the moment back into something he could manage. "You are overwhelmed. That is all. We can finish this and talk later." The words were familiar, the same pattern, the same redirection, and I recognized it instantly. But this time it did not settle over me the way it used to. It slid off, leaving something clearer behind. "No," I said again, softer but just as firm, and this time I did not look at him when I spoke. I looked past him, toward the man who had not moved, who had not interrupted, who had not forced anything into existence except the possibility that I could choose. He met my gaze without reaction, without approval or expectation, just that same steady presence, and for reasons I could not fully explain, that steadiness made it easier to keep going. "I am not doing this," I added, the sentence forming slowly but landing with more weight than I expected, because saying it out loud made it real in a way I could not take back, and for the first time, that did not feel like a loss, it felt like relief. Derek exhaled sharply, the sound controlled but tight, and I could see the way he was recalculating, trying to understand how the moment had shifted away from him, trying to find the point where he could regain it. But the room had already changed, the balance already tilted, and I knew, even if I could not fully explain how, that it was not going to return to what it had been. The officiant took a small step back, unsure, the ceremony no longer something he could continue without ignoring what had just happened, and the guests sat in a silence that felt heavier now, not expectant, but aware, like they understood they were witnessing something that did not follow the rules they were used to. My hand stopped shaking, not completely, but enough for me to notice, and I looked down briefly at the bouquet still in my grip, the petals soft, the stems firm, the hidden thorns still pressing lightly into my skin, and for the first time, I loosened my hold instead of tightening it, letting the tension ease instead of building. When I looked up again, everything felt different, not safer, not easier, but clearer, like the path in front of me had split into something new, something uncertain, but finally mine, and I realized that whatever came next would not be decided for me unless I allowed it to be, and that realization alone changed everything. The word no did not disappear after I said it. It stayed in the air, settled into the walls, into the silence, into every glance that shifted between us, and I could feel the weight of it pressing against everything Derek had built, everything he expected to continue without question. And for the first time, it was not me carrying that weight. It was him. "This is not happening," he said, not loudly, not yet, but with a sharp edge that tried to force reality back into place. Like if he said it enough times, it would become true again. And I realized that was how it had always worked. Not just today, not just here, but in every moment before this, where his version of events replaced mine until I stopped questioning it. I shook my head, a small movement, but deliberate, and it felt different from everything I had done before, because it was not a reaction, it was a decision. "It is," I answered, my voice quieter than his but steadier, and the contrast between them seemed to echo through the room. Because control does not always come from volume. Sometimes it comes from certainty, and I could feel that certainty settling into me with each second that passed. Derek took a step closer, and this time there was no attempt to disguise it as reassurance. It was direct, intentional, like he was trying to close the space I had created. But before he could say anything else, a subtle movement near the back of the room shifted the attention again. Not dramatic, not loud, just two men in dark suits stepping slightly forward, not rushing, not intervening. Simply present in a way that made it clear the balance had changed, and Derek noticed it too. I saw it in the way his shoulders stiffened, in the way his gaze flicked past me for just a fraction of a second before returning. "You think this changes anything?" he asked. The question directed at me, but carrying something else underneath, something uncertain, something that had not been there before, and I felt that question settle into me, not as pressure, but as clarity, because the answer was already there, already forming before I even spoke. "It changes everything," I said, and this time I believed it completely, not because I knew what would happen next, but because I knew what would not. I would not stand here and pretend this was my choice when it never had been. The room felt smaller now, not physically, but emotionally, like all the space that had been filled with expectation had been replaced by something more real, something that did not need decoration or approval to exist, and I could sense the shift in the guests, the way they were no longer passive observers, but witnesses to something that did not follow the script they came to see. The man at the back still had not moved closer, had not stepped in, and that mattered more than I expected, because it meant this was still mine, this decision, this moment. It had not been taken from me and replaced with another form of control. It had simply been given back. Derek exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but heavier now, and I could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he was trying to recover, to reshape the situation into something manageable. But the certainty he relied on was gone, replaced by something fragile, something that could not hold under the weight of what had already been said. "You are making a mistake," he said finally, softer now, almost careful, and for a second, that version of his voice almost reached me, almost pulled at something familiar, something that remembered the version of myself that used to listen, used to believe, used to stay, but I did not move. I did not step back into that space, because I could feel the difference now. The space I stood in was mine, and stepping out of it would be a choice I was no longer willing to make. My fingers loosened around the bouquet again, and this time, I let it drop, not forcefully, not dramatically, just a quiet release. The flowers falling against the polished floor with a soft sound that somehow carried through the entire room. And in that small, simple motion, I felt something else release with it, something I had been holding on to for far too long without realizing it. And when I lifted my gaze again, everything felt clearer, sharper, like the world had finally come into focus, and I knew without hesitation that I was not the same person who had walked down that aisle. I did not pick the bouquet back up. I left it where it fell, a small detail that should not have mattered but somehow did, because it marked the exact point where everything stopped pretending and started becoming real. And when I took my first step away from the altar, it felt both heavier and lighter than anything I had ever done, like walking forward without knowing where the ground would be, but trusting that it would hold anyway. No one stopped me, not immediately, not physically, but I could feel the tension rise behind me, the shift of attention, the silent question hanging in the air as I moved past rows of people who had come to witness something entirely different, something neat and predictable, something that did not include this version of me. "Emily, stop." Derek's voice followed, sharper now, no longer controlled, no longer careful. And for a moment, the sound of my name almost pulled me back the way it always had, almost made me turn, almost made me explain myself in a way that would soften what I had just done. But I did not stop. I did not turn, because I knew that if I did, I would be stepping back into something I had just fought to leave. My heels clicked against the marble floor, each step steady, even when my chest felt tight, even when the weight of every eye in the room pressed against my back, and I focused on the only thing that felt solid, the path ahead, the distance between me and the door, the space where he stood waiting without moving closer. The closer I got, the more I noticed the quiet details, the way the room seemed to shift around him without him needing to adjust, the way people instinctively gave space even when they did not understand why. And it was not intimidation, not exactly. It was something more precise, more controlled, the kind of presence that did not ask to be acknowledged because it already was. I slowed slightly as I reached him, not because I was unsure, but because the moment itself felt significant, like crossing an invisible line I could not step back over once I passed it. And for a second, I wondered what he would do, what he expected, whether this was another version of control waiting to replace the last. But when I looked up, I found none of that in his expression, just that same steady focus, the same absence of pressure that had given me space to choose in the first place. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly, his voice lower now, meant only for me. And the question landed differently than anything else I had heard today, because it did not assume, it did not guide, it simply asked, and I realized that was what made it harder and easier at the same time. Because the answer had to come from me, not from expectation, not from fear, not from anyone else's plan. I took a breath, deeper this time, steadying, and for a brief second, I looked back over my shoulder, not at Derek specifically, not at the altar or the guests, but at the entire version of my life that had led me to that moment. And I felt something settle into place, something quiet but certain, like a final piece clicking into position. "Yes," I said, and the word did not tremble, it did not hesitate. It simply existed, clear and grounded in a way I had never heard from myself before. He nodded once, not approving, not claiming, just acknowledging. And then he stepped aside slightly, creating space rather than taking it. A small gesture that meant more than anything else he could have done, because it confirmed what I had just realized, that this was still my decision, still my direction, and he was not here to take it from me, only to make sure I had it. Behind me, the tension shifted again, voices beginning to rise, not loud enough to form words, but enough to signal that the moment had fully broken from what it was supposed to be, and yet, none of that reached me the same way anymore. Because I was no longer standing in the center of it. I was moving through it, past it, towards something I had not yet defined but finally had the freedom to discover. And as I stepped forward, crossing the threshold beside him, I realized that the most important thing that had changed was not the room, not the people, not even the situation itself. It was me. Because for the first time, I was not being led, I was choosing where to go. The moment we stepped outside, the air felt different, cooler, quieter, like the world beyond those chapel doors had not been holding its breath the way everyone inside had. And I did not realize how tightly I had been wound until that tension began to ease, not all at once, but enough for me to notice the space around me again, the open sky, the faint sound of traffic in the distance. The way my heartbeat no longer felt like it was echoing in my ears. I stopped a few steps from the entrance, not because I was unsure of leaving, but because everything that had just happened caught up to me in that exact second, the weight of it settling into something real, something that did not disappear just because I had walked away from it. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing, letting the silence stretch without filling it, because I did not know what came next, and that uncertainty felt both unfamiliar and strangely honest. "You do not have to keep moving," he said from beside me, his voice calm, steady, not directing, just offering. And I realized that was the first time anyone had said something like that to me in a long time. The idea that I could pause, that I could exist in a moment without being pushed into the next one. I nodded slightly, more to myself than to him, and looked down at my hands, noticing the faint marks where the bouquet had pressed into my skin, the small imprints that had been easy to ignore before, but now felt like quiet evidence of everything I had been holding on to without realizing it. "What happens now?" I asked, the question leaving my lips before I could overthink it. And it was not directed at him in the way questions usually were. It was more open, more uncertain, like I was asking the moment itself what it intended to become. He did not answer right away, and that pause did not feel uncomfortable. It felt deliberate, like he was considering the weight of the question rather than rushing to fill the space with something convenient. That depends on you, he said finally, and the simplicity of it made something shift in my chest again, because there was no hidden direction in his tone, no suggestion of what the answer should be, just a quiet acknowledgement that whatever came next was not already decided. I let that settle, let the words sit without trying to shape them into something easier, and for the first time, I allowed myself to think beyond the moment I had just escaped, beyond the chapel, beyond Derek, beyond everything that had felt inevitable just an hour ago. The future stretched out in a way that felt both wide and undefined, not a straight path, but a series of choices I had not yet learned how to make. And the thought of that should have overwhelmed me, should have made me hesitate. But instead, it felt like something opening, something that had been closed for so long I had forgotten it was even there. Behind us, the doors opened briefly, voices spilling out before being swallowed again. Reminders that the world I had stepped away from still existed, still reacted, still tried to make sense of what had just happened, but it no longer felt like it belonged to me in the same way. I turned slightly toward him, studying his expression more closely now, noticing the details I had not allowed myself to focus on before, the calm in his posture, the absence of urgency, the way he seemed completely comfortable standing in a moment that most people would try to control. "Why did you come?" I asked, the question softer now, more personal, because despite everything, that part still did not make sense to me. The timing, the certainty, the way he had stepped into something that was not his and changed it without force. His gaze held mine for a second longer than before, not intense, not invasive, just steady, and when he answered, his voice did not rise, did not shift. It remained exactly the same as it had been from the moment he walked in. "Because you should have had a choice," he said, and the words landed deeper than I expected, not dramatic, not complicated, just true in a way that made everything else fade for a second, and in that quiet, I realized that what he had given me was not an escape, not a rescue, but something far more difficult and far more valuable, the responsibility of deciding what to do with the freedom I had just claimed. His answer did not linger in the air the way everything else had inside the chapel. It settled somewhere quieter, deeper, like it had found a place it had been meant to reach all along. And for a moment I did not respond because I was still understanding what it meant, not just the words themselves, but the space they created, the absence of pressure, the absence of expectation. The simple fact that I had been given something I had not realized I was missing until it was placed in front of me. I let out a slow breath, watching it disappear into the cool air, and I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was not bracing for what would come next. I was considering it, weighing it, deciding it, and that difference felt larger than anything else that had happened today. "I do not even know where to start," I admitted, the honesty of it surprising me as much as anything else, because I had spent so long pretending I knew what I was doing, following paths that were laid out in front of me, convincing myself that was the same as choosing them. He did not rush to fill that uncertainty, did not offer solutions or directions, and that silence was not empty. It was steady, like he trusted me to find my own answer without needing to guide me toward it. A black car waited at the curb, quiet, understated in a way that matched everything else about him, and I noticed it only because it was there, not because it demanded attention, and I realized that was how everything about this moment felt, present without forcing itself into control. "You can start by leaving," he said after a second, not as an instruction, not as a command, just a simple statement. A fact, and I understood what he meant, not just physically, not just walking away from the building behind us, but leaving everything that had brought me there, the expectations, the patterns, the version of myself that had accepted them without question. I glanced back once more, not because I was tempted to return, but because I needed to see it clearly, the doors, the place where everything had almost been decided for me. And I felt something shift inside me again, not regret, not doubt, just recognition of how close I had come to losing something I had not even realized was mine to lose. When I turned back, it felt final in a way that did not need to be spoken. And after that, I asked, softer now, not because I was unsure, but because the question itself felt different, less about fear and more about possibility. He studied me for a moment, not assessing, not judging, just present, and when he answered, his voice carried the same calm certainty it always had. After that, you decide what your life looks like, he said, and there was no promise in it, no guarantee of ease or clarity, just the truth, simple and unpolished, and I realized that was what made it real. I took a step toward the car, then another, each movement steady, not rushed, not hesitant, just chosen. And when I reached the door, I paused briefly, my hand resting against the handle as I felt the weight of everything that had led me here settle into something quieter, something I could carry without it controlling me. He did not open the door for me immediately, did not assume, and that small detail mattered more than I expected, because it confirmed what I already knew, that this was not another situation where someone else would decide for me. This was still mine. I opened the door myself, the motion simple but deliberate, and before I stepped inside, I looked at him one more time, not searching for permission, not waiting for reassurance, just acknowledging the moment for what it was, a turning point I had walked into on my own. He gave a slight nod, not approval, not ownership, just understanding, and that was enough. As I slid into the seat, the door closing softly behind me, I realized that nothing about what came next was guaranteed, nothing was planned or predictable, and for the first time, that did not feel like something to fear, it felt like something to claim, because I was no longer following a path that had been chosen for me. I was creating one step at a time, and whatever waited ahead, it would begin with a decision that was finally, completely mine.